Okay. Hey guys. Okay. So I wasn't planning on filming today. So you're getting full, this is what I look like when I'm just banging a quilt out in the studio. I happen to wear my sewing shirt today, so that's good. But no makeup, pregnancy hair. This is actually Baby Brown's first video appearance. So this is week 2 of the Modern Flight Quilt Along. And I wasn't planning on doing this video until week 3, but I got a little feedback from people who are brand new to paper piecing that basically said, until you show us how this block actually comes together, it's hard for me to wrap my head around how exactly I'm cutting this fabric. And nobody likes to cut all their fabric wrong, so I thought, let's move it up, let's do the video this week. So this is going to be a video on paper piecing. This is one of the 2 blocks, paper piece blocks, that goes into the Modern Flight quilt. And we're going to go through this block step by step, including how you cut your fabric for it. So buckle up, that should be easy. Not easy. It is easy. But if you've never done it before, this will be very straightforward. You will be surprised how easy it ends up being once you try it out a couple times. So first I'm going to talk about the tools that I have at my table here. I'm working on a tiny table, so if you see me looking a little inefficient, it's because this is not my normal setup. Okay, so I have a little cutting mat. I have a rotary cutter. I have a ruler. This happens to be, it's called an add-a-quarter ruler. You can use any ruler you want. An add-a-quarter ruler is cool because you probably can't actually see this, but essentially it has a lip right here. So when you butt it up to seams, it'll like stop at the edge of your fabric and at the seam you just sewed and let you trim something at exactly 1/4 inch, which is just nice. It like locks into place. I like it. I have a pressing mat over here and my little Aliso mini iron. When I'm normal piecing, I tend to have my iron on like as hot as possible without scorching my fabric. When I'm paper piecing, I have it set on like a medium setting. Basically, you're going to want your iron to be hot enough to make your fabric lay flat, but you don't want it hot enough that it's going to either scorch or curl your paper. Your paper will curl a little bit depending on the setting, but you don't want any steam because you definitely don't want this printed part bleeding onto your fabric, right? Which I've literally never had happen. But I could see how it would happen if you use steam or any kind of like water. So on paper piece blocks, you never use water until after all the paper is removed at the end. And then if you use a really high heat setting, your paper will curl a little. It won't actually affect anything, but it's just annoying. So keep it on a medium heat. That's my recommendation. So, okay, so let's orient ourselves in the quilt here first. So here is one of my Modern Flight quilts. I'll show it to you. It's a baby quilt. This is the top. This is the bottom. They look very similar because they have only these 2 blocks that face 2 different directions. So in some of my photos of this final quilt, I definitely took them upside down. So you're going to want to look at your actual layout page. There's a separate layout page for every size of the quilt, and it's going to show you what blocks on here are A's and B's. So this whole top row is A blocks, then B blocks. A blocks, B blocks, A blocks, alternates all the way through the quilt. So this block up here, which I'm going to fold my quilt so it's easier to show you because I'm sure I'm going to refer back to this. So let's fold this up. Here we go. Okay. So what I have here is my top A block. So if you're looking at the quilt, it's that top, let's see, if you're looking at it on paper, top left-hand corner. And this is an A block, as you can see by the label, that's paper pieced. Now if you look at these, the first thing you'll notice is they are opposites of one another. The angle here that this is pointing is the opposite of the angle of the diamond in this block. That's because the most fundamental thing to wrap your head around in paper piecing is that your paper pieced block, piece, whatever you're doing, literally this is the same for the most simple paper piece thing to the most complicated one. When you're looking at the paper printed side of this paper block, you are looking at the back of your final fabric block. So all of the fabric you add to this paper block is going to be facing away from the block. So you're going to be doing wrong side of your paper block to wrong side of your fabric. once your fabric's pressed back. So I'll show you how that works exactly. So let's just walk through the steps we're going to take in assembling this block. When you look at a paper piece, it almost always just uses numerical numbering. Sometimes there'll be a letter and a number, sometimes just a number, to show you what order we're going to add the various pieces of fabric in. So in this case, this diamond, your center diamond, is number 1. Then you'll add down here A2, one of your background pieces, 3 background piece, 4 background piece, 5 background piece. So in paper piecing, you don't have to pre-cut your fabric. I could hypothetically just grab like big scraps of fabric and go for it, and the only real rule in the piece of fabric that's going to cover one of these sections is that it's big enough to cover the section with room to spare for seam allowances. So I could take just a giant random piece of fabric and cover this little section, and that would be no problem. However, it's not very efficient, and because we're making all of these same blocks, we want to be efficient with our fabric, and it's way faster to kind of pre-cut fabric to cover each section. So that's what we're actually doing in week 2. And I'm going to show you the pieces I pre-cut for this block. Then I'll actually sew them on the block, so you get the full head to toe effect, right? I'm going to be talking a little fast because, as most of you know, I switched quilting studios recently, and somehow in that process I lost my big SD card. I only have my little SD card, so I don't even know how much video footage my camera will hold right now. So this might be quick. Anyway, okay, so let's just talk about this piece by piece. A1 here is a diamond, right? So you would think you can just cut out a big diamond to cover it, which is true, you can. And that's what you do. There's a fussy cutting template that is shaped exactly like a diamond. That's what you would do if you were cutting one-off pieces of fabric. If you were doing like different fabric for every one of your diamonds, you'd use that template to go cut out all those diamonds. If you're using a single or multiple colors of fabric that you're cutting from yardage or fat quarters, it's much more efficient to cut them out as this bigger trapezoid. It just fits easily. You can cut essentially a column into your fabric, and then there's a template that just lets you cut these angles, and it doesn't make you cut it all the way down to a triangle, but this piece still covers this full diamond on the back. So if that freaks you out, you can just cut out all of them as diamonds if you want, but this is more efficient, which is why that other template is in there. So that's what I did. I used this white as my center fabric. I cut it out, used my template. You're probably wondering why it's magically staying on my piece here, and that's because I glue basted it. So whenever you're using like one big piece of fabric that is your A1 section or your 1 section on a block that's paper pieced, it can be hard to hold that section right where you want it while you're also holding like other fabric up to it that you're going to sew together. And because there's no seam actually holding that first piece of fabric in place onto your block, it can just wiggle around a lot. So what you can do is glue based. I think I had a glue stick here. Oh, under the machine. So I have a glue stick. What I did is I just put a little bit of glue on my paper piece here, stuck my fabric on it with the good side facing out, and then I ironed it at a low heat setting. And you don't need to use much glue. It's just literally, I think I did like a dab, dab, dab across the back here. What that does is kind of temporarily adheres this fabric to the correct section without me having to worry about it shifting around. You don't have to glue baste. I didn't even know about glue basting for like the first 2 years I was paper piecing. So, but with like big floppy sections of fabric, very helpful. So one thing you might want, I'm gonna actually get a light out here. It might be a little weird for filming, but when I'm paper piecing, I always have a light source of some kind, essentially like behind my machine and facing me. Or I'll use a bright light if I have a bright light in the room. Because a lot of time, essentially while you're adding your fabric pieces, you're gonna wanna be able to see through, let's see if I turn this on. It blinds you guys. It's a little blindy, isn't it? It's very bright. Okay, let's see if we can do it like this. So basically you're going to be able to see through your paper to the fabric that's on the back when you're lining things up. Try different light sources. You don't have to buy, they sell special lights you can use. I don't have one, I just use room lights. But people love them, so whatever works for you. Okay, so A1 we essentially attached with glue, or you're just holding in place if you prefer. Now what we're going to want to do here is add an A2 section. So what we ultimately want is the fabric to cover A2, facing out on the back side. To do that, we're going to add a piece and then sew along this seam so that when we fold the piece back, it's covering the correct section. I will now demonstrate. Okay, so this is my A2 piece. This is the wrong side of the fabric. I'm using Kona, so it's a little harder to explain because there isn't a wrong side of Kona, right? But basically I want, if I look at the front of my fabric, or the front of my fabric piece here, this is the section I want to cover, A2. And this piece fully covers that section. It's like, I made sure it's bigger than you even need so that you can be less precise if you like. Now, in order to add it there, what we're going to do is flip the piece so that the right side of the piece you're adding and the right side of the piece that's already on the block face each other. And then I'm going to line this A2 piece up so that when I fold, when I add a seam on the back, this is hard to explain on this angle. I think I'm gonna have to switch you guys to like an overhead view. This isn't working well, right? Okay, pause 1 second. Okay guys, this is gonna be hilarious. A hilarious perspective, but we're gonna do it anyway. So, this is my paper piece. Let's just say we're gonna back up about 3 seconds here and talk about paper pieces, right? So this is the back of my paper piece, or like the front of my paper block, but will eventually be the back side of my fabric block. So I have added my A1 piece using glue basting, the back side of my diamond piece here touching the back side of the paper. And if I had a light that was showing through this, you would be able to see the shadow outline of exactly where that fabric is currently sitting. Now, what we want to do is add this piece, A2, to the front side. So this would be the back side of this fabric. I'm using a Kona, so there is no back side, but pretend this is like a print. This is the good side of the fabric, and this is the back side of the fabric. I can hold it up and show that it's gonna fit fully over this A2 piece when I'm done adding it. But where it's actually going to be, right, is on the other side of the block with the good side facing out. Now, to make that happen, what I do is I'm going to sew, this is where I want my seam line to be, is this nice line here, right? So what I'm going to do is flip this piece up so that just like any other kind of piecing, when you're sewing two pieces together, you're always sewing good side to good side, right? Then you press them open. Good side to good side, press it open. That's just standard quilting every single time, right? You're never adding two pieces both facing up together, because if you press them open, suddenly one of them's the wrong side. So, same thing in paper piecing. You're always adding your fabric with the good side facing the existing block, and then once it's sewn on, you press it back, just like in all other quilting, so that the good side is now facing out. So, what we're gonna do is we want, at the end of time here, this piece to cover this A2 section, like this, right? To do that, we're gonna flip it so that the good side is facing up. We're gonna put it on the other side of this block, facing the fabric, and we wanna line it up so that we can sew along this seam here, and when we press the fabric back, it still covers this section. So, when I had you pre-cut your fabric, I made sure that the pre-cut sections are plenty big to cover the areas they need to cover, so that we don't have to be crazy precise. In this case, what I'm gonna do is take this. So I hold my block up and I like look on the paper. Let's see, here we go. Now you're in the frame. I look at the fabric side and I like pre-place this a little where I think it's gonna need to go. Then I flip it over and I look at the paper side and I actually look through the paper side. So you're not gonna be able to see this on camera because I don't have a light source below it. But when I'm looking at this paper, there's a light source, any light source in the room. I can hold it up to that light source. Let's see if you can kind of see. And I can see through this paper where that fabric is lined up and that it's covering this seam. So let's just go for it, and everything will click a little more as we go here. So the first thing is, before I make any seams on a paper piece, I want to adjust my stitch length so that it is short, because at the end of this whole process, we're gonna rip the paper off the back of this. And the way that it's gonna come off easily is if essentially your needle has perforated all the seams well enough. And if you use a normal stitch length, it's not gonna be a small enough perforation, and you're gonna have a heck of a time getting the fabric off, or sorry, getting the paper off, and it's gonna stretch your seams out. So I use a 1.4 on my machine. 2.5 is the general setting, and a 1.4 is the setting I use. I'm gonna apologize ahead of time for how much the camera is about to shake while I'm using my sewing machine, because in order to get this angle, you have to be sitting, as you can see, on my table. Okay, so I have my fabric lined up. I'm gonna sew a line here. I'm using white thread, so you should be able to see it. Okay, so block side up, I sewed along this line right here. I start a little before the line and end a little after the line. Some people like to start and end directly on the line. Honestly, I don't think it matters. Okay, so when I turn this block over, as you can see, I've added this piece. This would be the wrong side facing up if Kona had a wrong side. So the right sides are currently together. And when I press this piece back at that seam, you can see that it's gonna cover the A2 section. And there's a little hanging off that will trim off at the end there. Okay, so the next step, people can get kind of tripped up on this. Once you've added a piece, before you actually flip it back. So you can flip it back to make sure it's gonna cover the right section. But before you press it back, what you wanna do is actually fold your paper along that seam, because what we want to do is trim off. We want to trim this to a 1/4 inch on this. So we want to trim off this extra white that's hanging over and some of this extra purple that's hanging over. So I'm going to go ahead and move this. Here, let's see. Can you see? Yeah, you can see. Okay. So one of the key things is if you forget to fold back the paper before you do this trimming step, you're going to cut off part of your paper block and you'll have to start over. Every single person that's ever paper pieced has done that. But let's try not to do it today. So I'm gonna fold my paper back. You can trim this with either side facing up. You're using the edge of the paper here as a reference. If you do the paper side, you're using the seam as a reference. If you do the seam side, I like to keep the paper side. And in that case, this add a 1/4 ruler is cool because if you slide it, it'll kind of lock into place along the actual paper here. And we can just trim off the extra there. So now you can fold your paper back into place. You can see I made this nice crisp 1/4 inch line there then. And now I'm going to use my little iron to press this fabric back. And now if you look at the back, I have a background color purple piece covering the A2 section. So now I'm going to do the exact same process again for the A3 section. So the A3 section, if I'm looking at the back here, again, this would be the wrong side of my fabric. I can see that my fabric is plenty big to cover that whole A3 section, including some room for a seam allowance. Perfect. So now I take the good side of my fabric that I'm adding, touch it to the good side of my fabric that's on my block, and then again, holding this up to a light source so I can see through the paper, I line this piece up so that when I sew on this line, I'm sewing through my fabric I'm just adding. And so I can I'm gonna mark actually here for you. I'll show you because you can't really see because you don't have a light source. I'll show you where I'm lining it up essentially. So what I did is as I'm looking through this block at my light source, I want the edge of my fabric to line up with essentially this pencil mark I just made that's a little past the seam line I'm sewing. So you need to catch the fabric on the other side. So here, I'll whip this seam on real quick and then I'll show you. Okay, so with my block, so this is how I would normally do things. I would add my seam. I start a little before the actual line and a little after the actual line. Then when I take it off the machine, I just immediately fold my paper back using that seam I just did as a guide. Put it down here on my cutting mat, take my add a quarter ruler or any ruler, line it up so that I'm leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance from that fold. Run my cutter along there, so I'm taking off the extra. Then I flip my paper over, so I'm looking at the fabric side. Fold the fabric that I just added back so that the right side is facing out. And then I press that seam, again, on just a medium heat, so I'm not hurting my paper, but I want a nice crisp line. Some people don't press between everything, some people just run their hand along it. Some people use, there's like a little roller you can use that I don't use. And then if I was just going about my normal business here, turn my block so I'm looking at the paper again, find the piece that I'm gonna be adding to this section. Again, I'd be looking at the back of the fabric when checking that it's gonna cover the section that I wanna do next, A4. It looks like it's gonna cover it great. So then I would take this fabric, flip it over so that the good side's facing the good side. And again, I'm using a light source. It's hard to demonstrate this part. To line my fabric up so that it's like this. So that if I was looking through if you could see the lines, what you would see here is this dark line here that I'm about to sew on would be running about a 1/4 inch, 1/3 of an inch into this fabric here. So that once I make this seam and I flip this fabric back, it's gonna be in the perfect spot. So you just hold that in place. Go over here to our machine. Again, I would take it off, like out from under my foot, and before I wouldn't flip it over or anything, I would just immediately fold back along that seam I just made. Take it to my cutting mat. It's a little hard because I'm squished here. Take it to my cutting mat, cut off any extra that's hanging out there. Yikes, sorry for the shaking, guys. Then I would flip my piece over and fold back so that I can see the good side of the fabric facing up. As you can see, my diamond is starting to take shape here. I'd go over to my pressing mat and just press that seam into place. I like things nice and flat. So now I take my next piece, and again, if I'm looking at the wrong side of the fabric, I can hold it up and see that it's going to perfectly cover this A5 section with a little room to spare. Then I would flip it so the good side is facing up, touch the good side to the good side of my fabric over here, and then line it up so that when I sew this line, I'm catching the fabric, and that when when I flip back the fabric, once that line is sewn, it's gonna be in the right spot. Again, the easiest way to do that is to look through your paper at a light source. Let me see if I can do this for you guys. Here, okay. Let's try this. So I have this light source. Sorry, it's gonna be real bright for a second, but it might help. You might be able to tell. So if you're looking at this paper against this light source, as you get closer, you can see the shadow of the fabric I'm adding and how it crosses this seam line I'm about to add, right? Because you got to catch it all the way along. So you want it to be nice and parallel, catch it all the way along, and it should fold back into place. If you're new to paper piecing, it is difficult to unpick a seam in paper piecing because you're using such a short stitch length. If you're new to paper piecing for maybe your first block or two, what you might want to do is set your machine on a really long stitch, like a basting stitch, add your piece of fabric, check that it's going to fold back and cover the section you want, and then go over that seam again with your shorter stitch length. That way, if you realize you did something at a weird angle or anything like that, you can just unpick and start over, and you won't have to be like picking out tiny little stitches. However, just like any other quilting, I've picked out plenty of stitches on paper piecing as well. So if you make a mistake, welcome to the club. Okay, so again, I just take it straight out from under my presser foot, fold back the paper at the section I just sewed, take my ruler, trim it down so that the excess fabric is just a 1/4 inch. Just cut at the end because it's off the table here. There we go. Throw that out, fold my paper back, flip it over, and then fold my fabric back so that it's covering my section here. Now, if you find that your fabric isn't covering the section, it's like too low or too high, then you just need to experiment a little with your placement of the fabric before you actually add your seam. So again, the first block you make, I would use a basting stitch and just try out the pieces. I can promise you the pieces you're pre-cutting will fit over the sections that they need to cover with some wiggle room to spare. So I also do, there's in the pattern, there's like kind of a shadow image illustrating where you need to line your fabric up before you flip it back. Anyway, this is our finished block. So the next step would be to trim this down at the edges of this block, and then add it to the quilt, and then once the quilt's done, you're gonna rip all the papers off the back, which is always a fun process. Anyway, that's it. I'm gonna circle back here real quick to the actual cutting. I know that was week 2 and what we were talking about. Let me grab a couple more pieces of fabric and I'll show you. So, you just saw me add the 4 purple pieces to this block, so you know they fit and they cover everything they need to cover. How I got those 4 pieces was like this. In the pattern, it will have you cut out a bunch of rectangles. Let's move this out of the way. Rectangles. Then there's a template in the pattern that's shaped like this that you'll put it on top of the rectangle and you'll cut the rectangle so that you end up with these 2 shapes that go on those larger outer wings. It'll have you cut these smaller rectangles, and then there's a template to help you cut that in half. or subcut it at this angle to cover the smaller sections. So that's what we're doing this week. If you haven't paper pieced before, if you're really nervous that maybe you're cutting everything wrong, then you could just go ahead and cut out little test pieces, and try subcutting them and look where they're gonna line up on your paper piece. Otherwise, you can just follow the pattern and cut out all the pieces, and then next week we'll be doing half our blocks. So that's it. Also, if you want to get a jump start on your blocks, now you know how. Go for it. Kate out.